This is where I need a step stool. Good evening. It is 6:30. Welcome to all of you here tonight, whether you're in person or online. We are so glad you could come. We are so glad that you have an interest in this changing world. My name is Ellen Oakes. I'm a co-president of the League of Women Voters, Greater Chippewa Valley. As an American voter, as a past Dunn County supervisor from 1990 to 2010, and as a member of the League, I find the rising tide of abuse of our democratic institutions extremely troubling. I hope you do too. Tonight we will hear from two area citizens who have weathered serious disruption of their public service. I'm going to surrender the mic now to my fellow League co-president, Anne Marie McClellan, who will introduce them.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for being here at the wonderful Mabel Tainter Theater. It's kind of intimidating standing up here. It's formality. But luckily, Stout has co-hosted this along with the League of Women Voters, so we thought it was a perfect venue to invite both the community and the students. So we thank you both for coming out here. Several of us League members attended an event for aspiring teachers at the University of Wisconsin in Eau Claire last year, where we had the opportunity to meet Dr. Tim Nordin, and this was shortly after he received some vicious threats just for doing his job as a school board president. In the League, we became aware of all the threats that were made to our municipal clerks just for doing their job, administering elections. And so we were kind of alarmed, as most are, with this uncivil behavior amongst people that are just trying to do their job. So what we wanted to do is open a discussion about this kind of uncivil behavior within our community and see where we're headed with it. So we invited speakers, Dr. Tim Nordin, from, as I said, the president of the Eau Claire School Board, because he has firsthand knowledge on how uncivil behavior affects both individuals and the committees that he serves and that we serve on. And Dr. Chris Freeman is a professor of social science at Stout, and he will share some historical perspectives as well as his personal experience as serving on a school board. So our setup is each speaker will have 20 minutes to talk, and then we have a mic down here. So for the last 20 minutes, we'll be happy to take questions and have an active discussion amongst everyone here. So now, also, we have a general meeting, the League of Women Voters, after the first hour. It will be short, but we hope that you all stay and just kind of learn about the League and what we have planned next. And now I'd like to introduce Kate Roberts-Edinburgh, who's a professor of communications at Stout and also the interim chair for the Center for Applied Ethics, who is the co-sponsor of this event.
And I will be brief because I want to hand the session over to our speakers so we can have that conversation that both Anne Marie and Ellen talked about. I am very happy that the League of Women Voters approached me to help co-sponsor this conversation, and I think we've talked about other events where we'll continue to inspire conversation in the community, with the campus, with students, with community members and citizens in the area, to talk about topics that I think we think aren't discussed enough in the community. So I thank you guys for inviting the Center for Applied Ethics to be a part of this. So with that, I'll hand it back over to you guys. All right.
Well, hi, everybody. Is this mic close enough that y'all can hear me? Okay. Is that better? If I go like that? I was a high school teacher for 5 years before going to graduate school, so I'm very used to using teacher voice. So even in theater, I was projecting, but I'll try to remain civil, I Thank you. You can see that Chris has a folder up here. He, as a professor, is well prepared and has a list of talking points. I, as a locally elected official and no one, I'm just going to freestyle it tonight. 3 years ago, I would not have been invited to be a part of this forum because I had not had that experience of living living through a time when we have seen, I think, an upswing in tactics used in our institutions to try to influence power, and that have become, I think, increasingly over these last few years, more and more uncivil. But I think over the past 3 years, as I have been just wrapping up, I guess, my third year as the president of the Eau Claire School Board, and I think we have learned a few lessons about how to respond in these situations. So I was asked tonight to just sort of share some of our story and some of the things that we've gone through, or that both we as a school board, but I, unfortunately, individually as well. Being elected to the Eau Claire School Board in 2019, I served my first year, and one of the things that I think our president at that time was very proud of is, one, we got our meetings done in 2 hours every time. He would announce the time. It is 8:58, and we adjourn. That was his signature. And our meetings were, quite frankly, boring, right? That's what we want our school board meetings to be, right? We discuss what we're doing, we do our business, and we get our work done for the schools. In 2020, you may recall that we had an event in the spring that shut our schools down. That was when I became the board president. So I've been board president through COVID and the following. And that, of course, was an adjustment to all of us. And before you start to think that I have any real wisdom to share, I will share a little bit of my naivete. At the start of COVID, we did vote to shut down our schools, just like every school in the state. The governor followed with the requirement, it had the requirement that we do so. And that was still really before COVID was here. Right? It wasn't in Chippewa Valley, it wasn't in Eau Claire or Dunn County, it wasn't in western Wisconsin. And there was a time, just for a couple of weeks, where I thought, maybe we'll miss it. Maybe it won't make it here. And obviously that wasn't the case, right? Sometimes I feel like, as a non-native of Eau Claire, that I feel insulated by the area, that we don't always experience all of the issues that we see on the news or that we read about in the paper. Right? Those things happen in New York, or in Chicago, or in Florida, or Texas, or California. They don't happen here. But of course they do. And the first time that we got our taste of it was during the fall of 2020, when an organized group of protesters filled our streets outside of our board office on the evening of, in August. I think approximately, by media counts, about 300 people outside protesting our plan for COVID school. Now, every district around here did something a little bit different. There wasn't a right answer in my mind, and we did the best that we could, but they were unhappy with that. And after that, they filled the room, which in many ways is perfectly fine, right? Our democracy can thrive when people want to protest, when they want to share, when they're outside, they're protesting outside, and that's okay. But when they came in, and that's when the shouting started. Right? And person after person filled our public comment and were shouting about us as though we were the ones who were, making every decision to specifically harm people. And the first realization I had there was that this loud group of people, who, you're welcome to come and speak at our public comment, but very few of them were actually from the Eau Claire School District, sitting right in the front, filling the space in our horseshoe, with a family that I knew personally. Obviously we disagreed on some of the issues, but they were sitting there with their 4 small children, none of whom attended Eau Claire schools because they lived out past Mondovi. We recognized people from around the area, and this group came and they protested here in Menominee. It was sort of a traveling roadshow to try to intimidate schools and school boards to doing what they wanted, right? After that, we realized that in a COVID era, there was not a safe way to handle that many people in our meetings. And we required after that the people coming to our meetings. And again, other districts chose other things, other ways to do it. So I'm not suggesting that we had the best way or the right way, but our choice was to say, you cannot be present in our meeting without wearing a mask. We're going to try to protect the safety of our staff, especially because we did have, I don't know, I'm not a contact tracer, but we did have staff members within a week of that big meeting where the protest was there and very few people were wearing masks, have to take time off for COVID. We said, we're not going to put our staff at risk. And then we had more people come in and they wouldn't wear the mask. And so what do we do? At that point, we had discussed as a group, and I think one of the things that we learned is that in order to combat some of the issues that we're having, in order to combat the attacks or the shouting, you have to be prepared. We had discussed as a board, what will our plan be? We had talked with our law enforcement officers about if we're in an unsafe environment, what can we do, and we had discussed a plan. And our plan was to call a recess to ask people to put their masks back on, and then at the end of the recess, hopefully people would comply. Or, I guess their other option was to leave. Just like most school districts nowadays, we do stream all of our meetings. That was always an option for people. When we recessed, the first meeting after that, there was only one person there who wasn't wearing a mask. She decided to leave. It worked fine. After that, there was a few people that wouldn't put their masks on. And a gentleman began shouting at me and approached our podium, and so we recessed the meeting, and ultimately we had to adjourn the meeting. So we get, maybe you watch the news. That to me was the first time realizing, oh, this isn't something that's just happening in other cities. It's not something that just happens in big cities. It's happening here. Later in the spring, we had, and throughout that next summer, we had, kind of continued there. We then had the next sort of phase of it, and I think one of the things that's important to realize is that this isn't accidental. Right? This isn't something that is just a bunch of people kind of getting mad and losing control for a moment. I think all of us can probably relate to a time where we lost our temper and shouted at somebody, and then had to go back and apologize and make things right. This is intentional. This is organized by groups who feel that this is the best way to drive power, to drive fear, and to drive votes to take power. And specifically at school boards, this was a target and intention. There are groups outside of Wisconsin, but inside Wisconsin as well, that are saying that school boards are the path to power up and down throughout. And we had people here in Eau Claire, and I think Menominee and other places that took that to heart on several occasions. So their next line of attack, of course, was critical race theory. We had a few people that yelled at us about that, as well as we had a group of people who interrupted our meetings. I think their plan did not go off as they had intended it to, but they had planned to disrupt our meeting. And a woman jumped up and started screaming in the middle of right after our Pledge of Allegiance, "You've been served! You've been served!" At which point, two of her colleagues ran forward with what amounted to a hostage, a ransom note, and threw them at us at our tables. Now, "you've been served" is a legal term. That was not what was happening. What they had was a packet of demands saying, here are the I believe it was the first time, I believe it was 19. A follow-up one was 22 crimes that you have committed as a school board that violate state, federal, and international laws. So you are all free to go home and say, I sat in a forum with someone who has been accused of violating the Nuremberg Code because asking our students to wear masks was considered by them a war crime. I'm glad that you laughed. If you hadn't, I might have put the mic down and just sort of slowly walked away. This happened several times. Our insurance attorney, this is a planned action that is supported by a group called Bonds for the Win, who encourage people to write up these lists. They have form letters that they then sort of fill out with their own and quote unquote serve them to school boards threatening their insurance. Our insurance attorney congratulated us that we had joined the ranks of different school districts that he was working with here in Wisconsin who had experienced this. And then he said to us, you know, most districts just get 1. You all got 4. So we had 4 different occasions where they did this. At one point we did have a process server come to our individual homes and sheepishly hand it to us saying, I'm just doing my job, which they were. You can pay a process server to take anything for you. But of course then we're dealing with this, and some of the ransom demands were change all of these practices within 1 day. Everyone on the school board has to resign. The superintendent has to resign. All of the books in this list must be removed from your libraries. You can never mention, you know, race or gender in any of your classes. And it doesn't stop there. Last spring, this is where if you know who I am at first, it's because of last spring, and I'm sorry to be a celebrity that you might have heard of. Last spring, we had a fairly contentious election for school board. I was on the ballot, this is why I'm part of it, and the 3 candidates that were running, there were 3 spots up, and the election ended up basically breaking down 3 and 3. The 3 candidates that I would say were running against the 3 candidates that I was aligned with, or the 2 others, were given a piece of our professional development that went out to teachers about safe spaces. Right? How do we protect kids in our schools to make sure that they are safe to share with caring adults in order to be who they are? This was specifically about LGBTQ students, who one of the slides was a discussion slide. It was talk amongst yourselves on these slides. But the presenter's notes said one thing to remember is that parents are not entitled to know their children's identity. They must earn that right. That was taken to be that Eau Claire was requiring teachers to hide the identity of students who came out to their teachers from parents. I think if you give it a fair reading, what you can say is that who I am on the inside as a person is mine to control. It is not the control of my parents, right? Children are people, and when you say that I have the right to every single bit of knowledge about my child that they don't want to give me, that I own everything about my child, hews very close to treating people as property. And we do not have a very good history in this country when we consider people as property, whether it is children or others. The candidates that we were running against took this news, made a press release, and with plenty of hyperbole, put it out to our media. This was immediately picked up, and I realized that this is a nonpartisan event. This was coming from the right wing on this case. I am not suggesting that this isn't a practice that happens from all sides. This is my experience, was from the right wing on this case. Right wing media in Wisconsin picked up the story and ran with it. Media on the national level picked it up and ran with it. So I and the district were named personally, like the superintendent, on websites like Breitbart, Fox News. We managed to make international news at the UK Daily Mail. And the more people that push this false narrative, right, this is not an attack on parent rights. This is an attack from them onto our students, to say that students don't have rights, to say that students are not people. This is an attack on our teachers. And this is where I think the real deluge of hatred, of incivility came in. It turns out I might use that 20 minutes. I said, I'm never going to fill 20 minutes. You're going to have to wave me off at some point. We started getting mail from people in town. We started having people at our public comment where we were called groomers, where we were called pedophiles, where we were called sinners, where we were called monsters. In an attempt to intimidate us, to stop supporting our students and to stop supporting our teachers, for keeping our kids safe. We received plenty of letters as the story grew to right-wing media across the country. We received plenty of letters from people. I received a hate message from someone who runs a group in Illinois. We received a religious tract and warning from someone who runs an operation out of Tennessee. And last March, I received an email on the day of one of our board meetings from someone whose email address in our contact form was killallmarxistteachers@gmail.com, which said, and I'm going to paraphrase because I don't quite have it fully memorized here almost a year later, I am going to kill you for your radical transgender agenda. I am going to shoot up your next school board meeting, and I will declare, it is time to declare war on you pedos. I will kill you and your entire family. I was at home, it was noon. My wife was inside working from home on that day. My 14-year-old son, my 14-year-old son at that time, boy, they grow fast, don't they? Was playing outside, like just outside on our trampoline. And as much as we'd like to say, well, you know, this is someone who has no intention. The real problem is that you don't know whether or not it's a real threat until you know whether it's a real threat. And quite frankly, it is too easy in the United States right now to imagine any public event being the site of a mass shooting. And that includes our school board meeting, where anyone could be in attendance regardless of your politics. Our staff are there, our school board is there, anyone in our community, and if you'd like to come and visit what I hope is a very boring meeting, come to our school board meeting, you could be there. And so at that point, I had to have my wife call our son inside. I said, lock all the doors, I'm leaving because I don't know who this is. The phone number that was placed in the contact form was a 715 number. I immediately left and called the school board office and said, I've received this death threat. And they said, we'll get in touch with the police, come on in, we'll take care, we'll rendezvous here. And I went down to the school board office, I spoke with the police. Thank goodness for the law enforcement officers and ECPD, they did an amazing job. They were able to take the information that they had, and they were able to work very quickly. They ultimately found that the person who sent the threat was in California. He was a 34-year-old man who was living at home and had sent the email through his PlayStation 4. Now, I don't know how many of you are video gamers. It may be a generational thing. I play plenty of video games. Maybe some of you that are slightly older than me played fewer, and maybe some of you that are younger will also be able to understand that it's the least effective email tool ever is a PlayStation 4. But thank God. So they partnered with a sheriff's office in Orange County, California, who went to that man's house, confirmed that he was at home, and were able to say by our board meeting that night that they didn't believe that it was someone coming. But when they traced the phone number, the fake phone number that he put in, it traced to just the other side of the state, near the UP. It's about a 4-hour drive from where that phone number would have been if it was his real phone number. At noon, when I received the email for our 7 o'clock meeting, if he hops in a car, or frankly if he gets on a plane at LAX, he can be in Eau Claire in 4 hours. Now again, we were fortunately able to realize that he was not likely to be here. He was still in California with no actual plans to come. But we had to have police at our meeting. We had to have that, we had to announce to the public, we've had this threat, we are going to hold the meeting because our police are certain that it's safe, we will have extra protection there. But that's disrupting our work. And our work, the way is for producing results for our children, to help our kids become the people that we want them to become, right? Eau Claire's mission is to help students to live creative, responsible lives, right? We can't do that when we are worried about our own safety, and that is the tactic, that is the intention. The man who threatened me, I guess, had a history of threatening many organizations, professors at the University of Wisconsin, out in Massachusetts. He was charged in Eau Claire. Those charges were dropped when he was convicted in federal court by the FBI for threatening the Merriam-Webster Dictionary Company. He also threatened Land O'Lakes. If you got extra time and you want to hear some funny things, we can talk about it later. But it's easy now, right? People have said that tragedy plus time equals comedy, right? I can joke about it with you right now, but in that moment, my family is at risk. My community is at risk. My colleagues are at risk. People that I love, people that I respect, people that I honestly don't know. but of course don't wish them any harm. So all of this to say, like, all of these experiences, what do we do, right? When people are trying to intimidate you, both from outside, both from inside, when they're screaming at you. And I hope that Chris will have at least a little bit of context to bring to that. I'm going to really put the weight on him to solve this all for us by the end of his 20 minutes. I will say that what we saw in Eau Claire, that changed the tenor of that election. We started talking about, is this the kind of behavior that we want in our community, in our school district? Is this how we want to approach our politics and our service? And Eau Claire in that spring election responded loudly to say no, that is not what we want. Right? The three candidates that were remaining, I would say civil, that were not promoting these false narratives won handily. If you add our votes together and theirs, it was slightly over a 10-point margin. Right? Eau Claire said, we don't want this to happen. And we saw in that spring election across western Wisconsin, many communities rejecting those sorts of arguments, that sort of hyperbole, that sort of speech and anger in favor of going forward. Now, I wanted to hit back. Right? After that, I wrote, I had a statement that I released to the press saying, this is my response to it. The first draft was not great. It was very angry. It was very, I'm going on the offense. But what I had to realize, and thankfully I have caring people around me to help edit. My wife is a wonderful writer. And she said, I think you want to tone this down a little bit and focus on what's important, which is our kids and students and our family. Right? Because the way to combat dishonor, the way to combat anger and rage is not by throwing it back. We have to be bold, and we have to stand up, and we have to call out hatred. We have to call out bigotry and racism and white supremacy. We have to be able to say those things. But we don't have to do it in a way that is disrespectful to even those that we're trying to listen to, because it is our responsibility to listen to everybody. We do listen to those responses. We do think about what's brought before us, but we want to go back and treat them. So I think the one thing that we learned through this is that, three things that we learned through this, and then I'll wrap it up. Thank you. One, plan ahead, right? Talk with the people that you're working at. Know that this might happen, and how will you approach it if it does? Two, there's a difference between offense and offensive, and you have to find the difference between that. And three, the best way to defeat this is by winning elections, by voting. Right? This is League of Women Voters. I think I'm on message here to say, go out and vote. And vote for people who represent the way that you want your community to be represented. Don't tolerate people that will come with this hatred. Don't tolerate people who egg that on or move it forward. Almost all of we still have some ongoing issues at our meetings occasionally, but it really dried up the moment that Eau Claire stood up as a community and went to the ballot box and said, we do not want this in our community. So vote. And vote for people that represent you in the way that you want it to vote for. We are at a tipping point where we could move away from, I don't care who it is or how they act, I just want them to get what their power. And that's not going to be effective, and it will not continue to carry us through. We have to vote for those people that represent us, not only with their ideas, but their demeanor. So I did fill the minutes. I'm very sorry for going over, but maybe Chris will appreciate that because he can go faster? I don't know. Thank you.
Wasn't that great? I mean, not great, but great. In a not great kind of way. I think one thing that I'd kind of like to address is the nature of what civil dialogue is. And so I'm not going to really concern myself with some of the crazy things that might have happened to me when I was on the school board, or some of the aberrations that happened in what is an increasingly violent society that we live in. So there's a difference between cultural violence, social violence, and then civil discourse. And that's kind of where I want to take the discussion a little bit to make us realize that, our civil discourse, it isn't that bad. When you put it in historical perspective, civil discourse, that is like discourse that's oriented towards the upbuilding of our citizenry, it's never been polite. If you compare ourselves to the Greeks, our civil discourse is just as rancorous and contentious as the Athenians were in the 5th century. When we're talking about the type of dialogue we need to have in order to sort of educate a citizenry about interests of vital importance to the state, you can only be as polite and you can only be as civil as the people to whom you speak. So, if you don't like the nature of political discourse in this country, I don't really think we need to look at political leaders. They're speaking to a context, and to an audience, and to a culture that's primed for the type of dialogue that we have. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention today, is that no civil dialogue can ever be more civil than the people to whom that it addresses, because it's a rhetoric. All rhetoric, your words have to bend to the ears of the audience. You can't speak above them, you can't speak below them, and you can't actually, explain the facts as you understand them. You need to create a dialogue that can be understood so that citizens can act. They have to participate in the dialogue. And so when we think about what that looks like, when we put it in the big picture, we're not doing too badly. I mean, think about the context for democratic discussion in ancient Greece. You know where it happened? It happened on the Pnyx. You know what the Pnyx is? It's a freaking rock. It's a large rock on the east side of the Acropolis. Has anyone ever been to Athens? It's freaking hot. All right? So if you're in freaking hot Athens on top of a rock, the type of dialogue you have can get very contentious. Now, when you address the ecclesia, which is about 15,000 hot, sweaty togas on the Pnyx, which is a hot rock in a hot part of the world, things got contentious, and they got contentious quickly. If you didn't speak in a way that conformed to the ears of your audience, those 15,000 togas would bundle you up, carry you off of the bema, which is the hot rock that you'd address your assembly on, and take you off of the Pnyx in a hot minute. Was that polite? Hell no, but that's not the nature of civil discourse, all right? So when we think about how the kind of context for the ways in which that dialogue has to operate, it really has to conform to the nature of the kind of culture that you're addressing, and the way in which that, we want to think about the rules for what this type of civil dialogue should be composed of. Now, I happen to be a classicist, so I could talk a lot about the nature of rhetoric. I mean, we could talk about Aristotle's treatise on rhetoric. We could talk about Cicero, my favorite quintillion. And you know what? I don't think Horace gets enough truck when we start talking about the nature of civil. Sure, he was a poet, right? But he understood the way in which that the civil discourse was always dependent upon reception and understanding the very nature of reception theory. I can't go on and reconstitute what the nature of civil discourse is, even if I was just to try to address Aristotle. Do you know that Aristotle's On Rhetoric is over 325 pages in a modern edition? How much time do I have left? I got like 5 minutes, people. So instead of talking about what civil discourse is, I'm going to talk about what it ain't. And this is historically speaking. We should really understand what civil discourse cannot be. First and foremost, it cannot be polite. It's never been polite. It never stood on courtesy, and it never stood on ceremony. Understanding how that kind of engagement operates, it's dependent upon the nature of the audience to whom you're addressing. And it's also dependent upon that kind of context. The reception, right, has to condition the way in which the dialogue operates. And I'm telling you, the more popular our voting population becomes, the less polite that we are going to become. Because a lot of the people that are brought in times of populism, they don't have time for standing on ceremony and politeness. They need action. They need words of action, and they need people that are going to address their particular needs. Now, this sure as hell happened in Athens during the Periclean age, because he brought in a radical new populist contingent into the voting population. He expanded the ecclesia considerably. And you know what happened to that discourse? It got less and less polite. That's because civil discourse isn't by its nature polite. It's conditioned by the people to whom you address. Same thing happened in this country. Obama, right? A populist. Brought in a bunch of people who had never voted before that needed specific needs addressed. They expected it to address their concerns. Bernie, populist. Those people he brought in expected their needs to be addressed with very specific workmanlike language. And Trump brought in more than all of them. We've got a radically expanded population that's part of our democracy now. They're voting. And if you don't think that substantially conditions the nature of, civil discourse, you got to read your Aristotle, man. Because we have to speak to those people who demand redress. So it changes all the time. So first of all, it's not polite. And the second thing you got to know about civil discourse, it's not smart. It can't be too smart. As a matter of fact, if you're going to be talking to your audience with your big smart language, with your 10-cent words that people don't understand anyway, they're going to hate you. Charlie, remember how sometimes I use words that were too big that people didn't understand and people got irritated? That was obnoxious of me. I was the one being uncivil. Speaking down to your audience, I made lots of mistakes in that school board. But you can't be too smart. I figured this out when I was campaigning with the good people in Knapp. I was out in Knapp and I was knocking on doors, right? And they're like, who are you? I'm like, I'm Chris Freeman. I'm running for school board. They're like, what are you going to do? And I have my 14-point plan, right? About how I was going to fix the problems with the school district nominee. Well, guess what, people? They thought their kids were doing just fine. They didn't need any damn 14-point plan. And so I would address doors and people would be like, slamming the doors. Especially if I used a word that ended in what I call the itties. If you ever use a word that ends in like I-T-Y, like, I don't know, intersectionality, or if you want to think about like positionality, any of these words, don't use them. They're uncivil. People don't understand them. They're conceptual. They're not specific. They're not concrete. So I had to change the nature of what I was talking about. And thank God the good people in that informed me that I was being uncivil. The last person, right, that I went door knocking on, I know I'm not supposed to use the F word. But she said, fuck you. I closed the door, but I think she said it in a nice way. I'm like, I am doing something wrong here, people. The problem was me. So the next guy, I go to his door, and he's like, well, what's your plan? I'm like, plan? I just want regular education. He's like, regular education? He's like, that sounds good. I'm like, yeah, regular education. I just want students to be able to concentrate on reading and writing, having some good math skills, so that they could like learn about things and express themselves, so they could, really advance an understanding of who they were in the world, protect their freedoms to learn in ways that make them feel good about themselves. And he's like, yeah, regular education. Well, damn it, I went with regular education for the next 12 doors, and I think I got 12 votes in that. It's the classic Aristotelian tragedy or strategy of the enthymeme. That's where you leave the critical third part of an argument out so that the audience has to fill it in. That first guy was like, regular education, that makes good citizens. Exactly, man. But they come to fill in the argument. So civil discourse needs to have space for people to participate in it. It can't be like a never-ending mansplain explaining to people why everything is wrong and everything is bad. Okay? So, it can't be too smart, man.
I don't think anyone's ever called me too smart before.
And here's the other thing. No special interest, people. You know, you can represent special interests, but you have to do it in a way that represents everyone. The classic example in the Menominee School Board, when I was trying to address bullying in the SDMA, especially regarding our LGBTQ plus community, right, and our marginalized students who came from minorities. And the people sitting next to me on the left and the right, they're like, all students matter, Chris. I'm like, okay, all right, fine. I had to stop talking in a way that advanced special interests. And like, let's do a student bill of rights. Best thing I ever done. Talking about those special interest kids in a way that advanced the rights of all the kids in that district. It delineated the concerns that, you know, was affecting those marginalized people, but we created a Bill of Rights, I think the only one in Wisconsin. And we got people on board for that one. So here's the thing, you can represent your special interest groups, but you have to do it in a way that makes sense, right, to the common sense of the people that, you know, are also part of that audience. And this is one of the most important things that especially the political left has to do. They have to create an argument that doesn't, you know, isolate certain interests, but that speaks in a common way that brings people in. You know, I teach peace studies at Stout. I'm a big proponent of Kingian and nonviolence, and this is King's genius. How he took a message that regarded special interest in marginalized people and put it in a context that made everybody believe. Right. So, special interests, that's a big deal. This is the other thing. I know I'm mansplaining right now, but you can't mansplain, people. This is absolutely uncivil. It's directing people what to think. And as soon as you start doing that, you're in a monologue. And once civil discourse becomes a monologue, right, it's uncivil. You know, when we get criticisms about the way in which that, you know, conservative folk push back against the words and the context and the seemingly directions that they are given by civil discourse. You know, telling them what to think, what words to use. It kind of feels like people are like word police. And when you are giving that explicit a direction about what you can say and what you can't say, telling people what they mean because they say a certain kind of, use a certain kind of phrase, or they express themselves a certain kind of way, you've already, you know, lost that audience. And you've already created that, you know, uncivil way in which that our current political discourse is operating. The last thing is, like, we got to get rid of political elitism. You know, who is that? You remember that one president we had? George W. Bush. That guy, man, he got it. He got it. He was an elite, East Coast elite. Went to Phillips Andover, Yale University, blue blood. But when he was debating, you know, another East Coast elite, he came across as a hard-working Texan. He was neither of those things. But when his common man approach, hey, you know what, Deb? I think you nailed this a little bit when you came to that event that we had at Harvey Hall. Do you remember that event? You did a good job there. Speaking to Menominee folk in ways in which that really made the people in the audience feel good.
But it was about speaking
And they made it our values, which was really interesting about the way in which that common person's approach, it doesn't speak down to them, it doesn't demean them, but it celebrates us. And that's a really powerful part of the way in which civil discourse has to operate. But it can't do that if it smacks of elitism. And in terms of how people experience those things, that's the most important lesson we can get from Aristotle, is that our rhetoric has to conform to the ears of the audience. And if it isn't pleasing to those ears, you're not engaging in civil discourse. All right, so you wanted me to say something about where we can go from here? Are there any good models about what goes on in terms of thinking about what civil discourse looks like? Well, I'll tell you, there's a couple more things we gotta know.
Leave time for questions, Chris.
In American history, switching gears now, leaving time for questions. Jefferson, he might be a good, example of civil discourse. No, I'm afraid not. Elitist, big words, sorry, not happening. Declaration of Independence actually isn't civil discourse. All right? If we're gonna make an example of who Jefferson was, he's sort of like Demosthenes, okay? Slave-holding elite. Madison, another great American orator, not a great example of civil discourse. Another slave-holding elite who thought himself Cicero, who was another slave-holding elite. You might think Sam Adams, who thought himself a Cato. No slaves with Sam Adams, but really didn't nail what an American civil discourse would look like. You know who did? Tom Paine, Common Sense. 150,000 copies sold before January 4th of the same year. We call it, or July 4th of the same year, Declaration of Independence. He published anonymously. Americans like that. He was funny. He was critical. Made it okay to hate monarchy. Drove citizens to action. Gave space for them to think through and participate in an argumentation about what the nature of that movement was going to look like to found a young republic. Beautiful example of American civil discourse. Of course, Sam Adams thought it was a crapulous mass, and it wasn't polite, and it wasn't courteous, but it did find place and space for Americans to express themselves. So thinking about where our discourse can go forward, I think that might be a good model to start thinking about, that can make sense of a very rancorous and contentious civil discourse that's never polite, it's never smart, no special interests, no mansplains, and Jesus, no elitism. If it's going to find a proper way forward. All right. Did I do it in 20 minutes? I did?
Yeah, it's about time.
Are you real proud of me right now, Ellen? Okay.
So there's a microphone right up here in the front that Anne Marie is about to turn on, and we would love to fill the last time that I did not overfill with your questions.
Step right up and ask your question.
I don't know why they always put these mics so tall, but it's all right. Well, first off, thank you guys so much for talking. That was super informative. I really enjoyed that. And I know this isn't necessarily your guys' area of expertise, but I would just like kind of your insight as, not my generation, into how social media and the introduction of social media has led to kind of the erosion of that civil discourse, because that's something that I've obviously definitely seen in my generation. And so I don't know what that perspective is from, somebody beyond my generation. And so I would just like your input on that, if you have any.
Well, I will come about as being very curmudgeonly. I think that social media has been a net negative for society. I don't have any particular solutions. I would really encourage you, if you are interested in the ways that social media impacts our society, our discourse. I've just recently finished an excellent book called The Chaos Machine by Max Fisher. Get it from your local library, buy a copy yourself. I think it really, to me, it really, to me, made me understand. We're all learning. Made me understand what I was feeling about social media and my discomfort, you know, in the ways that I've seen it used and the ways, you know, like certainly, like my candidate page on Facebook was assailed over and over again by, you know, trolling, which, you know, yeah, it may not always be polite, but it doesn't have to be that impolite, I don't think. But that's, so The Chaos Machine by Max Fisher, I think, is a great read for people that are looking for some, I don't know if you can assume you're that.
Yeah, I think that the big thing for me about the way in which that social media operates, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is such a compressed space, in that it, as well as other aspects of digital media, it tends to shrink one of the most important things that we have to have for civil discourse, which isn't being polite, but it's another P word called patience. Like, did you notice this when the president was addressing Congress? And like those people on Congress, like they started getting fidgety after about like 5 minutes. I think it's had a big effect on our attention span. And our ability to hear longer reasoned arguments now is becoming almost impossible. Aristotle suggested we should never make a logical argument that's got more than 3 components to it. Now it's coming to like 2. And those things have to be really short and to the point. So the biggest threat that I see is the way in which it's created a quick, cheap, and easy discourse that's shrunk our ability to have the patience to really listen to dialogue and then participate in how we might respond to that. Does that sound good?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
All right, good.
Does somebody else have a question, or can I ask a follow-up question? Am I good? Okay, I'm asking a follow-up. So you had kind of mentioned how Thomas Paine published Common Sense under the guise of anonymity. And so how do you think that sort of compares to the anonymity, or the, you know, however you say that word? It's an idity, but I shouldn't say that. But so how do you think that sort of compares? How do you think that's also been eroded, I guess, by the fact of social media? Because now you can, you know, hide behind the guise of I don't have to use my real name and I don't have to, you know, put any personal information out there. I can solely use this to get my opinion out, you know, without it being traced back to me theoretically. And so I guess what I'm asking is, how has that sort of also changed in the face of civil discourse through social media, that what the anonymity like presents? Does that make sense?
Yeah, is my kind of follow up on this one and then you go? Okay. I think just how you receive an anonymously published, well-considered, beautifully written treatise on, you know, what is to be done, that's got a long tradition that is, it still resonates with the fact that there was a person who crafted this, who took time in creating that expression. The anonymity that we have now, that is, you know, sadly, the instrument by which we find threats and ways in which that we find ourselves threatened by increasingly, you know, violent language, that's a whole different species of anonymity. And so it seems like social media and digital, you know, language has really had a negative effect on the way in which we understand the author, the authorship, intentionality, and this is the most important thing, is the aura that rides behind that. The anonymity that rode behind it, and I couldn't imagine what that would feel like. Like, I can't imagine. This is why I'm saying there's a difference between civil discourse and then this rising kind of violent culture that we're living in that is, advancing something quite different and quite new. All right, does that sound about right?
I don't have much to add to that. I do think that social media widens that space to be able to express those violent thoughts, right? It provides you that cover, and it is obviously much different than, publishing an anonymous, treatise, I think is the right word. It's probably too big for me even, but yeah, so I think it widens that space and it opens that door to make it okay. And that's why we have these corners and portions of the internet where, just violent, racist, misogynistic, all of these, can flow because it opens it in a way that gets rid of that aura, and the realization that there's a person behind that and that there's a person in front of it as well. Right? Thomas Paine's writing anonymously, but knows he is writing to an audience. Where social media, for those that you are attacking, become faceless. Right? I'm not a person to the person who's writing to me, calling me a pedophile and telling me he's going to kill me. And the blind of the separation of social media does that same thing. So that's, I guess, the little bit that I would add to it.
That's perfect, thank you. Sorry
Thank
for
you.
hogging the mic, but it's open now.
Thank you. I've been thinking about, The Rock is a specific location that discourse took place. And one, do you feel that we've transitioned to private spaces for the discourse of public, and has it had an effect on people who choose to put themselves into government positions? My phone number, address, and information about me is publicly accessible in a town this size. I mean, anybody could come to my house. So I think about that, like, has it affected, in some spheres, the transition to private, or do you feel that it has even transitioned to private spaces? No longer the halls of Congress, for example.
Yeah, there's, in so many different ways, we've lost the commons and we've lost that public sphere that was a vital part of the way in which, early American Republican discourse operated. There's also a sense that the scale has gotten so immense and so large that it seems almost impossible to effectively even wield it. I don't know. I know we've got, like, in the census, it was like 340 million people in this country, maybe 300 million citizens. It's impossible to underestimate. It's impossible to overestimate the impact of that scale and nature, what that public sphere looks like, how you can wield that or manage that effectively. We've had a number of different ways in which that people are trying to reassert states, but even states are almost beyond the scope of how we can create like a rock on which the ecclesia can gather, to engage in civil discourse. I guess when I think of how that, major transformation in the, leverage of the way in which that the upbuilding or the increase of population operates, I think that you can't have it operate the way that it used to, and you can't have that public sphere manifest itself in, like, town hall meetings. Those are, cute, but they're not, effectively allowing people to participate in that discourse. I think when I think of one that was effective, the very outside of what I studied was Enlightenment, Society of Letters. That Enlightenment discourse was often created across large spaces, carried, communication between people that subscribe to, erudite journals, and allowed people to participate in a massive scale. It almost seems to me that that kind of reawakening of that Enlightenment public sphere, where we saw people that were cosmopolitan citizens of a dialogue about what it meant to be human or what human rights were, I think that's kind of where it has to go. And I think that actually the internet can be an effective way in which we can exchange these types of letters, but it has to escape the kind of anonymity of the sniping that operates in the way in which that, social media has denigrated that great potential. So I guess that the idea that I'm dealing with here is that we're going someplace almost beyond what we consider to be a nation state as a vehicle for understanding what the dialogue of the public sphere actually is all about. And I think that Enlightenment discourses in societies of letters can be a great step forward.
So we certainly have, an ongoing fracturing of the monoculture, right? For good or for bad, right? But I just cut my Netflix off. I'm now on Hulu. You're on Apple Plus, right? We don't have that one event. We don't have the 3 channels on the TV. Okay, I was probably 5 channels when I was younger, but the point is, we have these smaller spaces, right? And our social media that was promised to bring us together actually then siphons us into these smaller groups and brings us apart from one another. And it allows for the breeding of extremism and this violent discussion and violent language that I think actually has the biggest chilling effect. We saw across the state school board members resigning, people unwilling to run. I got to tell you, it's not a real good paying job, right? It's not something that you do at the local elected level as a career. It's something that you do out of service. And I think it's less necessarily the privatization, but I mean that splintering has an effect that when we talk about public schools or public institution, we don't have that forum. And I think Chris is probably right that it could be, the internet could serve that. That's the purpose, is to connect us in that larger way, to allow us to expand our dialogue across space that isn't possible face to face in a state of 8 million people or a country of 340. Right? It could connect us in that way. But we do see that chilling effect, and we do see that the intimidation now with some of that media coverage that does connect us impacts away from us. Eau Claire has not, has stood against this, that we've responded as a community, we've tried to take care of our own. But we frequently hear from other regional school districts, well, we don't want to get in trouble like Eau Claire did. We don't want to go through that. So we're not going to make that choice. We're going to back away from it. And we're not, in my view, going to do what is best for our students and our community, because we're worried about the violence, we're worried about the attacks, we're worried about, and maybe that does privatize some of that discussion. And so that is the chilling effect, not only on people who want to serve in our public and degrading the trust in our institutions, but then it also has impacts around us, because that connection almost goes the wrong way. It looks like Ellen might be ready to move us on to the next part.
I think one is a...
Do we have one more question?
Yeah, one quick question.
I'm afraid it's not a quick question. But I just, Chris alluded to our history. And when you're talking about Jefferson and Madison and Thomas Paine and you mentioned Hamilton, we did not say, go into the civil discourse that was characterized by that our cherished founding fathers. I mean, and how they had their own newspapers, like Breitbart and Murdoch, and that just wrote scandalous articles about each other, and how they wrote anonymously using Greek or Latin Roman names, and how they just basically politely just skewered each other at every opportunity they could.
Yeah. I think when we think about the nature of contentious debate, it's incredibly nourishing, but I think one thing that has to be developed, and I feel like I'm advancing an argument that normally you wouldn't associate with, a liberal academic, but it seems to me that that cultural milieu, people had thicker skin. I mean, they could tolerate a lot of deep criticism in ways in which it seems like we aren't able to in the present moment. So I don't know. I'm not opposed to taking a deeper look at the way in which that Enlightenment dialogue really had this seamy underbelly. They called them Grub Street hacks that were, writing in England, was writing in France, was also writing in the United States. People that were creating a very critical dialogue that was boyish, it was perverse, it was almost pornographic. And that was a vital part of what that, early American civil dialogue was all about. As pornographic and vulgar as, American culture is now, it didn't just come out of nowhere. We've been perverse and vulgar for a very long time. And finding ways in which we can sort through some of that, get a little bit of it, but not have to wade through it as if it was, the sum total of our, civil dialogue. I really do have hope. Here's the best example. Spotify finds me some damn good music, right? It has a logarithm that's finding things that I like to hear, that's expanding my horizons, that's thoughtful, that's like, I'm like, whoa, where is this mix coming from? Who's that song? Like, all the time. We've got the technology that can bring together dialogue, that can uplift. The Greeks called it phronesis, the uplifting, right, of the soul, right? The way in which that we can be better citizens, better thinkers, expand our intellectual and moral horizons. Technology can do that. It's just that we tend to isolate ourselves in these very narrow platforms that doesn't allow that kind of buoyant diversity of discourse to emerge. But I believe, right, that by following some good models, we could find a way in which that we can kind of restore some of that ways in which that we can be connected to things that matter, and that can really, develop a renewed engagement in civil discourse that isn't polite, that isn't too smart, that isn't too mansplaining, and all the other ways in which we talked about that today. There you go.
Thanks everyone for the opportunity to share with you. I'm going to move right over to Ellen because she's looking at me with less patience than I would like, but as much as I...
Thank you for talking about hope, because we have hope. And I want to say, Tim, what you did for us, that after you got that threat, what did you do? You went out and knocked doors. You went right back out into the streets and started talking to people with truth and respect. And that's what I think, that's what this organization does, is empower voters and defend our democracies. And thank you very much, Chris and Tim, for giving us hope.
I dearly wanted to ask a question about the entertainment value of news. But now listening to Chris Freeman, apparently that's been going on for a long time too. I really want to thank you both for coming tonight, for being here with us and sharing these experiences. I'm going to be boring now, and we're going to go through a brief League of Women Voters meeting, which we have to do 4 times a year as part of the rules for being League of Women Voters. So if you would like to be more comfortable elsewhere, or you can stay right by your bottles of water, that's just fine. I'm going to call the meeting to order. And the minutes of the previous general meeting have been sent out to members, so you should have those. Do I have a motion for their approval?
I made a motion to approve the minutes.
Anne Marie moves to approve. Do I have a second? Brenda? Was that Brenda? Joan seconds. Wonderful. Okay, all in favor signify by putting your hand up. Opposed, same sign. Very good. The treasurer's report was all sent out in advance as well, and we just need to have consensus on that. So if you had a chance to look at it, if you just put your hand up that you're agreeing to that treasurer's report. Very good. Any opposed? Very good. I want to do a recap on the school board forum that we held just a few days ago. A school board forum, my goodness, yes.
February 6th.
February 6th, thank you. And we had more than 40 people in in-person attendance. I've heard that we had hundreds either watching it at the same time live stream or checking it out afterward. So I think that really did get the word out about the people who put in the time and hard work to become school board candidates. We've also recently celebrated the 103rd birthday or anniversary of the development of the League of Women Voters. And we had a very fine party, even though it rained on us and kind of cut our attendance. But we were able to send 18 cupcakes to a student's class who attended the party and was able to take those on with her because I ordered too many cupcakes. Voter service announcements. Is it Brenda or Jane who will speak to that?
Oh, okay. I don't think I need to go up. I think I have a good voice.
There's a microphone right there.
Okay. Let me put my glass. I could read to you about 18, well, probably 12 or 13 voter registration events that are now posted on our website. I'm not going to do that because most of you here will get to that website, and I encourage you to do it. A lot of voter registration events needs volunteers. We have 40 people supposedly trained to do voter registration, but not had the opportunity to really be out and about to do it. I want to assure anybody that's looking and hasn't done it for a while that you will be with someone who has done it quite frequently. And that's how you're going to learn. That's what you need. You need to see it in action and be a part of it. You need to be asked questions that you cannot answer. And you say, hey, Donna, will you help me? Because that's how we're going to do it together. No one learned it all by just taking one class. So please go to the website, lwv-gcv.org. Go to the calendar. Click on the dates. Get the specifics. If you really have questions about it, in the specifics it will give you the name of the organizer of that event. Call them. Ask your questions. Get comfortable and know that we want you to come. We do not expect perfection because none of us have it. So that's what I really want to say. There's a lot of them, a lot of high schools. If you've ever had any background in high schools, it's a great time. It's absolutely a fun time to be with those students for many different opportunities. And again, if you've never done it, go watch, see how it's done so that you too can participate a little more fully in the future. So that's what I'd say. There's a lot of them. Go to the website, check them out, and join us. Thank you.
Good job, Jane. Jane Peterson, she's been working with voter service since we got started just a scant 5 years ago. And it's probably the most recognizable arm of the League of Women Voters, the helping people get registered to vote and getting the issues out there so people can make their decisions on them. Then the final item on our meeting tonight is to point out that we are looking for nominations for several offices in League of Women Voters, because Anne Marie is finishing her term at the end of June, and we need another co-president. Our secretary has run through her term, and we'll need another secretary. You will have seen a piece of paper being passed around. Anne Marie had some sheets of paper, so if you didn't get one, and if you know somebody who'd be interested, or if you'd be interested yourself, we're always looking. So keep your eye on the ball. That's how this kind of thing can continue in Menominee. So glad to see everybody here. So glad to have been part of this tonight. Have a good evening.